Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hello and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Dan Moulthrop. I'm Chief Executive here at the City Club and also a proud member. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Associate Editor of N+1 and author of the book Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace, Nikil Saval. How we work depends in large part on the space we occupy while at work. And when you think about it, when you really stop and think about it, workplaces can be rather strange, especially cubicles. Nikil Saval takes that approach, examining something deeply familiar and helping us understand just how strange it actually is, chiefly focusing on the long-term rise of the office, from its roots in 19th century counting houses to contemporary cubicles where 60% of Americans now work. Cubed provides a thoughtful analysis of the transformation of the white-collar American workplace set amidst a backdrop of literary, cultural, and political insights. From the rather boring atmosphere we see depicted in popular culture references, such as the television show The Office and the comic strip Dilbert, to the more fantastical designs of the Googleplex. I knew I was going to stumble over that one, the Googleplex. Mr. Saval's analysis questions the motives that offices are designed with the worker in mind. Is the architecture, after all, of white-collar office space designed to stimulate or oppress its workers, or just maximize occupancy? Mr. Saval lives in Philadelphia and is an associate editor at N+1, a journal of culture, politics, and literature. Cubed was published in 2014 and is his first book. Dr. Saval also recently completed his graduate work at Stanford University in the Department of English. Congratulations, sir. In his academic work, he studies the relationship between modernism and music, as well as Marxism and urbanism. He has published essays in the New York Times, the London Review of Books, and the Huffington Post, among others. But Mr. Saval's first two real jobs were as an editorial assistant in publishing companies, where he worked in cubicles. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Nikil Saval.
That's a real gong. I thought everyone was just joking. Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming on this very snowy day. This is my first time in Cleveland. The weather is divine. But actually, I'm from Philadelphia, so it's not too different. I'm very pleased to be invited, and thank you for arranging this. I'm pleased to be part of what has clearly been an illustrious roster of guests here. I hope I will not do them any shame. History of the office is, as some of you might have imagined or wondered, a very curious thing to have written about. I often feel that myself. Sometimes, why did I do this? Why did I get myself into writing about the office? Most people who have worked in offices quite justifiably think the topic is boring or unworthy of consideration. Ever since I had even broached the idea to people that I was writing such a thing, the reaction has been one of dismay and concern for my well-being. Oh, they sometimes say in blank confusion, history of the office, that's interesting. Or sometimes actually more often, oh, as if I'd made some terrible life mistake, and they were quickly running through the ways in their head that they might save me. I would always respond by saying that the office was not at all what they thought it was, or at least it was never meant to be. From one angle, you can look at the office in the 20th century and see it as an attempt, constantly renewed, at creating a social and architectural utopia. Offices from the outset offered a refuge from the horrors of early factories. For women, they offered an exit from the home. And around the turn of the century and well into our own time, skyscrapers, such as the Seagram building, which you see here, define the heart and skyline of major American cities, and now many Asian and some European cities as well. It was the forging ground as well for that most cherished of American notions, the middle class. At the same time, I have to concede that the office has been experienced by so many people and represented in pop culture, as in the images from the film shown here. The one on the right is King Vidor's The Crowd, an excellent film from the early 20th century. One on the bottom left is Jacques Tati's Playtime. This was before the invention of the cubicle. He actually imagined it taking place. He foresaw it. And also a great film. And of course, the top left is Office Space, which probably many of you have seen. So at the same time, it's been represented as a social and architectural dystopia. Skyscrapers, in many ways, have represented real estate speculation at its worst. They brought crowds to downtowns. Women who enter the office routinely have faced sexual harassment, a form of discrimination that, in fact, could not really be named until the late 70s. And office work has been represented as dreary and mind-numbing, and without the satisfactions of even making something real. Above all, the design of offices has been held out for disdain and censure. The question I kept coming back to in researching the history of the office is why? Why these two, why this disjunction? Why have offices been, why are they supposed to be good? And why have they often turned out so bad? Why have the best intentions of designers and managers often run aground against social reality? Though I attack this question from many angles in my book, one theme that I will pursue here is the issue of design. Design is what we experience most immediately in the office, as well as the thing that we talk about symbolically. We make complaints against the office in terms of the position it puts us in, physically, the sense that we're stuck in a cubicle, that we can't go anywhere. And the sense that you're forced to stare at a computer screen all day, that you push papers. It's just there's just something about the office that makes you feel. The complaint is about the shape of it, the way it closes you in. In a way, that's where the title of my book comes from, not just the cubicle, but the sense that you've been boxed in an office. This is a film clip, but I realized we can't play it right now. Oh wait, we can. No, never mind. Not right. Yeah, sorry, I added that at the last minute perversely. But the cubicle is in some ways already old news. This is, of course, a strip from Dilbert, one of, I think, several million strips that Dilbert has done on the history of the cubicle. But we have new problems. There's the open plan office, which many people consider to be worse than the office cubicle. I don't know if some of you work in open plan offices. This is the new-ish thing. And maybe even worse than having an open plan office is not having any office at all, freelancing, which occupies about 20 to 25% of the workforce right now, according to some estimates, and is expected to reach 40% by 2020, according to an estimate by the software company Intuit. That is in some ways the future of the office, having no office at all. We have new sources of complaint, some of them about the organization of space and design, and some of them about the organization of work. So how does design reflect society? And why do we fixate on office design as a solution to our social problems? To understand that, I think we need to go back to the beginnings of the office and the relationship between what I see as design and discontent. I argue in my book, and I will argue here, that the shape of our workplaces has often been a response to some sense of dissatisfaction, perceived or explicit, on the part of the workers in those workplaces. And this is true if you go back to even the beginning of the office. This is an image from the early days of the office, when the office was young and full of hope. They were sort of small, sometimes one-room affairs. People probably know the story Bartleby the Scrivener, or of course, A Christmas Carol. They consisted of a clerk, a bookkeeper, a partner. White-collar workers made up a very small portion of American society, of British society as well at this time. And workers in them, however, felt that they belonged to a separate stratum of the workforce. There was this kind of nascent idea of the middle class even then. They were neither manual workers nor properly capitalists, properly merchants or people of business. Partly this was due to the cleanliness of their work. Partly it was due to their attire. White-collar workers at the time were the first, the term white-collar comes from the fact that people would wear these sort of detachable white collars that they would purchase at Brooks Brothers. They put them on, go to work, and then take them off. And you kind of wore this, except for the collar, you kind of wore the same attire in the office that you wore on the street. That was not true of manual workers. That gave them a sense of status. And partly it was that they worked in very close proximity to their bosses, and they could imagine their path upwards very easily. It was very plausible in the antebellum era that workers could rise in their firm. And this was well known in popular culture at large. This is a board game called Office Boy from the 1890s. Very popular. It was sort of reprinted. I'm not sure what the correct term is, in the 1920s. It's a very easy game to play, as you see. You always win. Eventually, you always do get to be partner of the firm, as long as you're not, some of the bad squares are inattentive or careless, or you speculate, and then you have to go back. But you start at the bottom, office boy. It's the lowest position, and then you end up as a partner of your firm. So this was, young kids would learn the kind of parables of upward mobility as a kind of game. As with many things, things changed after the Civil War. This is the home insurance building in Chicago, one of the first skyscrapers. This story is well known. I won't sort of retell it, but railroads united the country. The concept of a corporation came into being. Business became big business. And the need for clerks became enormous. Their tasks became differentiated. And because things grew so quickly, so big so quickly, efficiency became the watchword of the day. I mean, at this time, it was just so, the growth of offices was so fast that people didn't really know what to do with them or how to organize them. And so you had the emergence of figures like Frederick Taylor, who I'm sure a lot of people know. Frederick Taylor was one of the founders of management theory, scientific management, he called it. He really focused on the factory. He wanted to rationalize operations in the factory and make them more efficient, standardize tools, standardize motions so you wouldn't have extraneous motions. Everyone would do the task that they were apportioned to do in the quickest time possible. He called it the one best way. His acolytes attacked the office as a similar problem. They rationalized envelope licking. The fastest way to lick an envelope was calculated by the Taylorists. They also invented the standing desk. This is from the 1910s. Because they were so concerned about workers' motions, they insisted on workers standing from time to time to reduce fatigue. This lesson was lost for many years, as I'm sure you know. And on the left, that Wooten cabinet office secretary desk. That was the standard desk of clerks before the Civil War. And you see that that's a desk that is yours, that you can kind of burrow into. It's sort of like it encloses you. It's like a desk that hugs you. And then what Taylor did and his acolytes did is they thought that this desk was not appropriate for a new office. They needed to standardize it, so they invented the efficiency desk, where it was flat. If anyone walking around, any manager walking around could see exactly what you were doing. So that was one of the major changes introduced in the office in that time. And so, the net result of all these changes in the early 20th century, this is sort of a whirlwind tour of this, is that the office worker no longer felt like a sort of intimate, upwardly mobile figure. Business Week wrote in 1929, the clerical employee is no longer as intimate as he used to be. He is anybody at all, a worker, almost a number, like a mill hand. This had effects on the self-perception of the office worker, the perception that one was naturally going to ascend the corporate ladder, that one was inevitably going to become part of the business class. Though office workers in the US had few union affiliations and rarely organized, by the 1930s, they began to feel the pressure of losing ground to factory workers, who of course were organizing en masse at that time and with whom office workers increasingly began to identify. So this cartoon here it's a little difficult to see, but it's because it's from a union newspaper at the time, is meant to emphasize the unmanliness of the office worker. You see that you have workers in overalls, factory workers who go into their boss's office, J.J. Sourpuss, and manage to get all their back pay and get their hours cut. Whereas the shrinking, shirking, also quite bald, that seems to be important, clerk, is like, gee, I wonder if I should just ask for last week's pay. There was a lot of feeling that the white collar workers were unmanly at this time. So the response, I would argue, to this kind of perception that office workers who were the supreme individualists at the time might unionize, that kind of fear on the part of managers, was twofold. One was architectural, and the other was psychological. Now, many architects at the time, some of them indeed socialists, but many of them not, felt that social unrest of the kind experienced across Europe and in the US in the 1930s could be solved through improved architecture. Some of you may be familiar with the maxim of the French architect Le Corbusier, the most influential modernist architect of the 20th century, who said in his book, Towards a New Architecture, that we have a choice between, quote, architecture or revolution. And he ended that sentence by saying revolution can be avoided. And he implied through architecture. And one of the results of this, I think, was the onset of what is known as the international style in architecture. It's just a way of referring to lots of different types of buildings, but basically they use steel frame construction and glass curtain walls. They had advanced technology, air conditioning, fluorescent lighting. It was originally of European origin, but achieved its fullest expression in the office architecture of the US. Some of you may recognize at least two of these buildings. The one on the left is the Lever House on Park Avenue, and designed by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill from the 1950s. And right across the street, on the far right, is the Seagram building. And below both those pictures, you see the interiors of those buildings. The one in the middle is called Connecticut General, which was one of the earliest office campuses in suburban office campuses. And like sort of the Googles of today, it offered, it's from the 1950s, it offered many amenities, bowling alleys, it offered woodworking classes to its employees. It was a very kind of advanced corporation of the time. It was a sort of elevation of office work, this kind of architecture, an attempt to make office workers feel that they were different from everyone else. From the outside, it looked like a beacon of American ambition. And on the inside, the interiors, as you can see, were totally organized and modern, done up by some of the greatest minds in design. But the old fear of worker discontent lingered, and added to it in those Cold War years was a new fear of communism on the part of the employers. People know the 1950s to be proverbially an era of conformity, the organization man, et cetera. But it really is, I mean, if you sort of look at the history, corporations did work hard to ensure a certain kind of sameness in the workplace. IBM famously had all its employees dress up in the same uniform of suit and black tie, black suit, black tie. And another sort of way to ensure this kind of conformity was personality testing. Tests that had originally been used in hospitals for the mentally disabled became used in corporations for the first time widespread in the 1950s. So in 1952, 1/3 of US corporations tested their prospective employees. Just 2 years later, in 1954, over 60% tested their employees. Again, using tests that were originally used in mental asylums, including Sears, Westinghouse, and General Electric. The testing process went to the heart of family life. According to a study by Fortune magazine in 1951, half of all companies actually screened their prospective employees' wives. One company estimated that 20% of their candidates were turned down because the company didn't like their wives. This was the environment into which, moving on a bit, came a sort of odd and tragic office visionary named Robert Probst. Tragic because he was a visionary, but became known as the inventor of the office cubicle. He was a laconic, kind of conservative man from Colorado, but in other ways, he was a man of the 1960s. He spoke highly of individualism, and he thought the conformist office atmosphere of the earlier office made the office a kind of wasteland. And he set out very strongly to remedy this. He was one of the first to research behavioral and social sciences and try and figure out how people actually behaved in offices rather than how they should behave. He gave out surveys, he experimented on himself. He wondered why people should be sitting all the time, suggesting that office workers should be in motion, again, rediscovering an idea that had been lost, but then proposing it again. He also thought that the walls in offices, the walls that were around the corridors and that people had private offices in, should come down. He was inspired by developments in Europe. In the 1950s, Europe, coming out of World War II, became this kind of ferment of new ideas, and it invented what was the first open plan office. This is the Bürolandschaft. The office landscape is how you translate that literally. And it had as you can see, it has very few walls, and those are in fact not for offices. They're for break rooms. The break room was invented at this time before, I don't know if people remember, coffee carts used to trundle around but then you could actually go to a room, take a break. It looks very chaotic, but actually there's a plan behind this. It's organized around communication and paper flow. The desks are people's teams. So this was a very influential idea and very radical at the time. And Probst was one of the figures who really got into this in the 1960s. He began to experiment with dividing up the office a little bit. So on the left, you have his first attempt, Action Office 1, which you can see the office worker is just working so hard that you can't even see them. He's just blurry. He's just like running from his standing desk to look at, he just took a coffee. He's like looking at a magazine. He's in action. But this was seen as a little too free-form, and it was very expensive at the time. So then Probst came up with his other idea, which is you see on the right. It was 3 interlocking walls. It was meant to be very flexible, but again, the emphasis here is on motion. This is an advertisement photograph of one of the earliest installations. A guy pointing, another person, and it's very much a sort of active, flexible workspace. Action Office 2 was received as a revelation. People thought came out in 1968, revolutionary year in many ways, in unexpected ways as well for the office. Probst turned out to be very successful. He was a little too successful, in fact. Actually, there were 42 different versions of Action Office by the year 2000, by Probst's own estimate. These are 2 advertisements for the Action Office. But they would all be known by the same name. This is Action Office in 1978. People turned Probst's concept into a one-size-fits-all box. The cubicle. They found that it was the easiest way to cram as many people as possible, as quickly as possible, into as little space as possible, for as little money as possible. The cubicle was not just sort of bad design, but a symbol. I think the cubicle would not take on the kind of resonance that it has for us today if corporate culture had not changed in the 1980s and 90s. A new corporate ethos came into being in the 1980s, under which layoffs became more and more common. And it was no longer plausible to keep your job in the kind of conformist, stifled atmosphere of the 1950s. And it was more likely that you might switch careers a lot, that you might be laid off. So cubicles began to, I'm pointing to a couple books here that really changed the corporate ethos of the time. Japan is #1, is an example of people feeling that Japan was going to overtake the United States. That was very powerful at the time. It's not so powerful at the time now, but China is another kind of specter. Flexibility became the watchword of the day. So I think under that rubric, the cubicle became this kind of symbol of impermanence, of transience, and that was the era in which Dilbert really took off in the 90s. So contemporary office design has kind of taken its cue from this era. It sort of reflects this change. It reflects the kind of flexibility that was achieved in an earlier era, the flexibility of moving careers, moving jobs, sometimes not under your own will. The office at the bottom there is GlaxoSmithKline's office in Philadelphia, which I visited recently. You can see it's quite open, it's quite transparent. Nobody at Glaxo has their own desk. It's also a completely open system. You have lockers. You enter, I don't know if people work in offices like this now. You have lockers, you enter, you take your stuff out of a locker, sort of like high school. People do put posters on their lockers, and like when it's their birthday, anyway, you can imagine. It is pretty silly. And then you put your stuff on your desk, and at the end of the day, you have to it's a clean desk policy. You take everything off, you put everything in your locker, and then you go home. On the right is Indy Hall. It's a co-working space in Philadelphia. You probably have more than a few of those here in Cleveland. This is chiefly for freelancers, and it's where you rent a desk. I think this is one of the more astonishing developments of our time, that people who don't have to work in offices actually pay to go work in an office. But it is, you can see it's very informal, unlike Glaxo, which is designed by top designers. Robert A.M. Stern was the architect. Hayworth contributed the furniture. Indy Hall has just a bunch of IKEA furniture. But it is meant to be sort of flexible. But really, in a way, I mean, whereas Glaxo looks like the kind of more advanced space in this situation, it's really taking its cue from places like Indy Hall or cafes. I mean, I think it reflects the need to have an office that is more attractive in that regard, that is more flexible, where you do sort of roam around in a way more like the original Action office. But it does all seem kind of good compared to the cubicle world or the kind of factory world of the early 20th century. But the progress might be somewhat illusory. If in places where workers have more choice, it turns out in historical situations, they have almost invariably chosen private offices. So what happened in Europe in the 1970s, this is something that's relevant now, when the open plan was introduced, they had workers' councils or unions or sort of informal organizations that required co-determination in the management of companies. And one of the things that entailed was actually the design of offices. So across Europe, especially Northern Europe, workers rejected the open plan and they rejected in favor of private offices. And so actually Europe became in some ways more innovative as an office design hub than the United States. So that's the Bürolandschaft, the office landscape on the left. And on the right, you have, from the 1980s, the Scandinavian Airlines building, designed by Niels Torp. It's very advanced in the sense that it has these sort of spokes along the side with private offices, and then running through the center is a street, a kind of urban paradigm. So the idea is that you would come out of your private office, go into the street, run into people. This is, for any of you who have visited Google in Mountain View or some of the more advanced offices today, this is a very common concept, the idea that an office should be more like a city and less like a kind of bureaucratic workspace. Nonetheless, we may be, the lesson of this, I think, today is that we are rushing towards a sort of open plan setup, but we are repeating a kind of familiar design mistake that was made then, that was made before, was made with the history of the cubicle, imposing an idea on workers that they may not actually want or may not suit their needs. The other sort of development that I've been talking about is the rise of freelancing. I think people make claims today about the possibility of the office disappearing thanks to technology, but one of the real sources of the so-called disappearance of the office is the rise of people who work on contract, people who don't actually have to be in the office all the time. And this is a huge development, an enormous one. I mentioned that they were 20 to 25%. And I mean, it's hard to estimate. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has not done a count, but many people estimate 40. That might even be pretty low. And so you have organizations like the Freelancers Union, which is not really a proper union, but just an advocacy group, which advocates on behalf of the rights of freelancers, because this may actually become, if not the majority, a substantial minority of American workers. I think people seek freelancing. I am a freelancer because of the freedom it offers, but it also offers insecurity, and many do not take contract jobs by choice. I think we need to think about these fundamental changes. This is in the workforce. These are the sort of changes that we have to keep in mind when considering the future of the office and the future of work itself. And this is something that becomes clear when you look at its history. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm going to do a little housekeeping.
Oh, yeah, sure.
And then we'll do the Q&A. Oh, no, we don't do that till the end, but I'll let you do it at the end, I swear. It's very serious. Nobody's ever done that. Actually, somebody has. There was one. Never mind. Okay. Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're enjoying a forum featuring Nikil Saval, author of Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace. It's no longer a secret. You all know it. He's also associate editor of N+1. We encourage you to formulate your questions for our speaker now and remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. Be sure to tune in to our Friday forums on 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, which is our primary media partner, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. On Wednesday, January 28th, the City Club will host a panel discussion on boosting the achievement of anxious students. That's actually focused on students overcoming trauma. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at cityclub.org. Today's program is presented in partnership with the Beechwood branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library and Engage Cleveland as part of the Engage at the City Club series, sponsored by SS&G, which is now known by BDO International. Thank you very much. We thank you very much for your support, and congratulations on your wonderful merger. We welcome guests at tables hosted by Vocon. Thank you very much for joining us today. And now we'd like to return to Nikil Saval for our traditional City Club Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. And holding our microphone today is Content Associate Teddy Eisenberg. Do we have our first question? Now you get to do it.
Can you stand? Nikil, thanks so much for that. That was really informative. I actually have two questions. And the first one is, do you have any data on, has there been studies done on the productivity of workers when they're in offices that are well-designed or designed adapted to their needs versus not? Is there any research on that? And then my second question is, I'd be very interested in your opinions on the role of human resources departments and how that plays into this whole debate about how we work and where we work.
Right. This is productivity. This is a famously painful concept for office designers. I asked this question myself many times of people when I would tour offices for my book or when I visited Herman Miller or Steelcase. And they would just sort of wince. They'd be like, no, not the productivity question, because actually it's very hard to measure. White-collar productivity is very hard to measure. And so there are certain things, I mean, it depends on the work. So if the best studies that have been done tend to be the kind of work that is measurable, that does have an output that you can measure. So for example, there was a study at Stanford. I don't have the precise numbers, but this was of telecommuters, actually. So this is not strictly office design, but flexibility in one's work arrangements. And that did substantially increase productivity to be able to work from home for call center workers rather than to work in an office. Usually what you find in these studies is rates of preference and happiness and discussions of distraction. So people who work in open offices report higher levels of stress than people who work in private offices or even cubicles. Higher levels of just discomfort, distraction obviously is a huge problem. Oral is in hearing and visual, and so that's that you see. I mean, if you statistics on preference, I mean, I think it's something like there was a study done in the late 90s which suggested that 93% of people who worked in cubicles preferred not to work in cubicles, which meant that so you wonder who the 7% are, who are, it's just, I would like to meet them. But then of course now you actually find, and this is anecdotal, this has not been studied, but you find that people who work in open plan offices often express a preference miss their cubicle, they miss the rag that they wrapped themselves in, the security blanket. So to answer your question, it's very hard to measure. You really often when people study office design, they're studying in some ways preferences and moods and behaviors, and often not able to measure productivity. I mean, you could say, sorry, this will be my concluding. One thing that people do measure is they'll say, we moved into a new office, how is the company doing, after moving into our new office? But there's so many variables at work that it could just be that the company debuted a new product that is way better than, so it's very hard. Your questions about human resources. When it comes to human resources, I don't have a kind of prescriptive analysis of this. Human resources, in a way, comes out of this development I was discussing earlier with regard to the kind of sense of discontent in the office workforce in the 1920s. The movement was then called the human relations movement, but there's also personnel management. And that is chiefly a response to Taylorism. People thought that Taylorism was this treated office workers as too much like numbers, too much like machines, too much like robots, basically. And it wasn't working. I mean, there were actually in factories especially, there were lots of revolts, lots of strikes. Congress held hearings about Taylorism. Taylor was invited to speak before Congress, and was very defensive and did not really win the day. And so personnel management is the kind of origin of human resources, which brings psychology into the workplace. I mean, it seems like it's a development that comes out of the fact that a perception that is true of all work, but it's very much recognized in office work, that office work, a lot of it is psychological, a lot of it is, when people speak of office politics, they're speaking about the intangible aspects of work that are not about completing tasks. And so human resources in some ways fulfill that role. In some ways unions could also fulfill that role, or a similar role. And so they do have a strong role in the kind of psychological management of workplace tension, I think, and that's really where it comes out of.
Question. In your study, I'm sure you've seen a lot of office workspaces, a lot of innovative places.
Too many. Yeah.
I just wonder what your favorite and why, like what you saw that really kind of blew your mind.
I like my home office. It's really, you guys should all come check it out. It's really cozy. I just have a bed. I just sleep. No, I've seen. I saw a lot of things that I admired. I guess the spaces that I found most interesting, and I don't think any of these are ideal. I think that that's always a mistake and this is obviously a repeated mistake. The notion that we found the office that is going to work for everyone, and we're going to just repeat it everywhere in this kind of cookie cutter style. That is doomed so many offices and to hatred, if not oblivion. But the ones that I found that work the best are the ones that try to manage the amount, not just within the space itself, to manage the kind of amount of open versus private space, personal workspace versus workspace that's held in common. So I visited a company in San Francisco called GitHub, is anyone familiar with that? That was a pretty interesting space. They had just moved in, and it was extravagant because they had just gotten a sick amount of venture capital money. It was just so they were boom, and they just were throwing it everywhere. They had a replica of the Oval Office in there for some reason. And it's just, Silicon Valley guys. They just are just throwing it, just making it. And so they, but the guy who, Scott Shakin, the guy who kind of helmed the design, one thing they really focused on is ensuring that their engineers in particular, who are often introverts, they often don't need to collaborate. There's way too much emphasis, I think, in contemporary office design on collaboration. A lot of work that we do is private, needs concentration, not just engineers. There was just a lot of space for them to retreat into. And the other kind of key thing is that they had a lot of choice on whether they came into the office at all. There was a high proportion, something like 70% of their workers were not really there all the time, which is odd because they spent so much money on this workspace that no one comes into. But but the idea being that there's that control as well. It may just be that your workday needs to be staggered. It may not be suited to the office at all, and that requires a lot of extra work on the part of an organization. You have to ensure that meetings are open, can be done online. I mean, that the minutes are posted. I mean, they have to do all this stuff so that people can somehow participate in the life of the organization without it being, nuts. But from all appearances, it seemed to work. And they take their cues from companies in Europe. They've been doing this for a long time in the Netherlands. I think actually the U.S. is in many ways just catching up to what's been going on in Northern Europe now. And so, but if I were to sum it up, it would be this kind of level of choice on the part of the workers and within the office as well as in how they stagger their work.
A quick observation, then a question. I was visiting some friends in Mountain View, one former Google employee, and they had a startup company out of a garage just down the street from a new Google building going up.
Right.
And their standing desk was coffee table books stacked on a table.
Yeah, yeah.
And that worked fine for this 5-person company.
Right.
And there was a lot of collaboration because they were all in the same room.
Yeah, yeah.
But I wonder if you had heard any rumors yet about the new Apple headquarters and what that might look like.
Yes. So just an observation in response to your observation about the standing desk. I'm actually a big skeptic of a lot of things about the office, in case it wasn't obvious. But one thing I do actually admire is the standing desk. I think I have sort of unreserved admiration for it. I mostly stand when I work. Then I get lazy, but I don't have a standing desk. I just have a bookcase that is basically my height, and the key is really that you shift positions from time to time, or you pace, that you're walking and that you're in motion. So really, the investing in standing desk is it's not really worth it. You just need some books, you need a lectern. But it doesn't need to be hydraulic. You don't need to push a button. Ooh, but check out my standing desk. It shouldn't be like that. Anyway, the Apple campus, yes, I've only seen architectural renderings and somewhat of the interior as well. The Apple campus, has everyone seen this? Has anyone seen it? Renderings of it? No. In Cupertino, designed by Norman Foster. Allow me to say, with all due respect to the late Steve Jobs, it looks ridiculous. It's like one of the most ridiculous objects, just narcissistic, self-aggrandizing, just absurd. It looks like it's a giant ring, and it's set and nestled in this classic landscape of California oaks, and the ring it looks like a spaceship or a toilet bowl, or people have been referring to it informally in architecture circles as the Apple donut, which is kind, because apple donuts are delicious, and it's just. So the idea is that it's supposed to be a super green building, but of course it's suburban. It has room in its garage for 2,000 cars. That's not very green. And you just sort of circulate around the building. And the idea is that you run into people while you circulate. This is, again, everyone knows this intuitively, that you do run into people in the office. You have conversations that are occasionally useful, mostly just shooting the, I'm on camera, so I don't. But Steve Jobs, with all due respect, was obsessed with this idea, far out of reason, and he had to be reined in occasionally with this circulating, serendipitous encounter idea. Some of you may have heard a somewhat fallacious story about the Pixar campus. I don't know if people are aware of this story, that Steve Jobs wanted, they always tell this story, Jobs wanted he just wanted 2 bathrooms in the center of the building. Has anyone heard this story? This has been repeated a lot. And it was repeated by Jonah Lehrer, who subsequently had to recant because it was a disgraced journalist. But he wanted 2 bathrooms, and the idea is that everyone would run into each other on the way to the bathroom, which, it doesn't take more than a minute's reflection to realize that this is ridiculous. The last thing you want to do is innovate and disrupt things when you're on your way to the bathroom. It's just, you're just like, I've been walking for 20 minutes and I have to get to the bathroom, and you want to collaborate? Or you have this interstall epiphany while you're just like, at Pixar, and you're just like, at the beginning of Up, we'll kill off the mother 30 minutes in, and sorry guys, I didn't mean to ruin that if you haven't seen it, but but so our jobs as architects actually reined him in. They were like, Steve. I mean, and so there are 8 bathrooms. You know, they're like, and so anyway, the idea of that encounter that animates the Cupertino campus. You know, so I think it's a pretty silly building.
Sure, sorry. So my question relates to the future of office space, and you know, we talk about co-working spaces,
Yeah.
and how you can get, you know, people share the space, and more people can essentially use the same or a smaller amount of space, or the modern like floor plate in modern buildings are more efficient, or technology, right?
Right.
For something like a law firm, you can start digitizing the law library, so spaces are shrinking.
Right.
That's the trends as far as in commercial real estate, I believe, that we're seeing. So do you think that's going to continue being the case with the office spaces in general, or are we eventually going to not need office space, or it's kind of a big question.
No.
So,
Yeah. But it's
Thanks.
Thank you. It's certainly something I've had to wrestle with. At the same time that making predictions is very, very risky business, which doesn't stop people from doing it all the time. And I'll do it right now. I mean, my sense of it is that it does seem likely that, I mean, there are cost reasons, technology, all sorts of reasons that the use of office space is being considered more and more inefficient. To have a lot of it is becoming, it's hard to actually track. So like if you look at, you know, I once looked to, my hypothesis was that New York City would be seeing more office to condo conversions, which used to be big at a certain point of like Class B office real estate, and that was actually that was increasing. Then it slowed down because of the current tech boom or bubble, or you know, whatever you want to, and that's because they actually require office space. Places like GitHub or you know, New York City-based firms then, or BuzzFeed or whatever, they want office space. They have lots of it, so it's actually growing. But in other cities, it does appear to be shrinking. It does seem likely that what is happening is not that the office sort of disappears, or even that its physical footprint disappears, but that it becomes used for different things. Right now, we use it for very nearly everything that takes place at work. But it's already clear from anyone's life that the office has bled out of the office envelope, and that, you know, any surface is now an office, unfortunately, and or you know, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill, and that you know, airports are offices, cafes, of course, and that what is more likely the case is that the office becomes a place for meetings, for transacting, something like organizational culture, and that offices tend to are more likely to fulfill that role, because they wouldn't. I mean, again, the co-working instance is a kind of profound instance of the idea that people seem to need it. They don't need it every day. I mean, at Indy Hall in Philly, very few go in every day. It's something like a few times a month is the most common thing. But what that does is it means that there's more informal work taking place on city streets. You see, of course, a lot more interest in urban life these days than before. And urban life is really springing up to support office work, partly through initiatives and partly just through happenstance. I think that more and more cities are resembling giant offices, even when they're not in an office. So it's more likely that the office is just being spread out, and it's being spread thinly, than it is about to disappear. And of course, the changing nature of the workforce reflects that, the fact that fewer people are in fact tied to specific companies than they used to be.
Oh, great, thanks. Thanks so much for your presentation. Such a huge focus on the inside of the office and what the inside space looks like. It made me think, do you do any studies or thinking about office location, the actual outside physical presence, what the outside looks like, where it is, how important that is to people, and what do you see in terms of changes going forward, or you know, things we might be able to expect?
Yeah.
Look at the outside. Thanks.
Yeah, no, it is something I have thought about and something I write about a good deal in my book. I mean, you know, it is there's sort of two ways to approach this. Historically, you could say that the office originally, didn't talk about this, but has always sort of distinguished itself in terms of geographic locations. So even those early offices, like when there were very few offices, those clerical offices, they were gradually separated from manual workplaces, which they were attached to. They would have different kinds of architecture, Greek Revival architecture, Ionic columns, sort of engaged pilasters, things like that, to sort of suggest that they were elevated. And they would often, and this is unique to the United States and as well as to London. It's now changing cities elsewhere as well. They were located in downtowns, and only really, in downtown is really, there might be other examples, but New York is one of the few places where downtown is downtown itself. But downtown is an American concept, and it's associated with office development. So that's historically been the case. And of course, the birth of skyscrapers, that also is very American. It's now Asian, of course, as well. The biggest change and the thing that we may be retreating from was the suburbanization of offices. So in one respect, you have in the 50s, there was this huge push to suburbanize a lot of a lot of headquarters even. I mentioned Connecticut General. A lot of the move was to get away from cities. Cities were seen as bad for all kinds of reasons. They had labor unrest. They were racially more diverse than they used to be. There was this big fear of nuclear war, that people would actually, that your company would be bombed in a city, and they wouldn't actually go out to Bloomfield, Connecticut to bomb your particular company. They wouldn't be like, I hate this insurance company. And that would have, that would have been a more interesting Cold War if they just won. But so that was, if you drive along a lot of corridors now, some of the most classic of these, the sort of corridor around Princeton, the triangle around Duke, North Virginia. You see a lot, I certainly see this a lot in New Jersey just because I'm close to there. You see a lot of these places being abandoned. And there's just tons and tons of just wasted space. What to do with it is actually like a huge social challenge. And it's not, some architects have been like squatters. There is this kind of radical architect type who's just like, we should just squat. And that's like not a serious, it's not that people do it. Squatters just do it or they don't, but they don't, it's not like something you can just, it's not a program. And actually, I don't know if any of you guys have been to Sao Paulo, or there's a lot of squatted buildings in downtowns, in the old downtown of Sao Paulo, and then in Caracas in Venezuela. So it does happen. So that I think that is something that we're retreating from, as much as people talk about campuses, right? As much as Google and Facebook and those places are at the center of our minds. Of course, the other thing that's happening geographically, and this is a big topic that we can't really go into deeply, is that the distribution of work across time zones and places. That's something that has increased. I'm sure people have experienced this in their lives, that you have an office that works with a team in Shanghai and also has like a team in Bombay or whatever, and that's sort of already happening. So there is this kind of, and some of that is a sort of international division of labor. That may change as well. The fact that a lot of back office operations were located in other countries, but that may not, those are being displaced. That is just the process of global capitalism or globalization or whatever you want to call it. So that, I think, those are the sorts of trends. I think a move towards the city, and this is only true in the United States. Actually, if you look at India, I'm South Asian. I've spent a lot of time in India. There's a very big attraction to the suburban campus because they're like, this is what tech companies do in the United States, and we too want to follow this sort of model. And there's much less space. It's much more wasteful. These are countries that have severe energy problems, but it's a kind of historic thing that they want to follow, that they want to emulate. So a lot of the changes that we may be seeing towards some kind of modest sustainability in the United States are being obviated by developments in the developing world. So that's a sort of big picture answer, but there's a lot that's happening geographically.
Congratulations. If you stand right here, I'm going to say something, and then you can ring the gong for real. Thank you. Okay, here, step over. That was fascinating. I really wish what we had booked for the afternoon between this event and the Beechwood Library event is a tour of various office spaces with you, but we didn't do that, and you're going to go to the museum instead. So anyway, today at the City Club, we've been enjoying a forum featuring Dr. Nikil Saval, author of Cubed, A Secret History of the Workplace, and associate editor of N+1. Thank you very much, Dr. Saval. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.